The silence in the narrow alley of a medieval town weighed differently. A cold promise that clung to your spine even before the first pale blue hint of dawn. You found yourself squatting in the musty shadows, the rough stone wall pressing dampness into your back. A chill that felt as if it seeped straight into your bones. Around you, the village remained wrapped in a veil of fog, the brittle snap of frost underfoot, quietly announcing the world waking up. The acrid scent of unwashed bodies mingled with the sour tang of moldy straw in your cramped hideout. Your leather gloves, worn thin and patched more times than you could count, itched uncomfortably against your skin, reminders of a day that promised less glory and more grime. If today a dead phone battery drives us mad, imagine the frustration of seeing your last spark of fire fade, leaving you shivering under a threadbare cloak that had soaked up every bit of cold this town could offer. Outside, the clatter of wooden sandals echoed hollowly on wet cobblestones. Fragile church bells tolled drowsily in the distance, and the village slowly shook off its slumber. You wiped the rust from a tiny crooked dagger, a dull, repetitive chore that dulled both blade and spirit, before settling back into the uncomfortable rhythm of waiting. Your stomach growled, subdued by the scratchy, bitter bread traded off a haggard merchant last night, stretched thin with sawdust. It was a reminder that even the simplest meal came with compromise, and hunger was the shadow you wore constantly. For all the tales of daring thefts and narrow escapes, your life was mostly uneventful waits. The scrape of rough fabric against your rashed arms. Nights spent crouching in darkness to avoid patrols. And curiosities like the sudden silence of barking dogs slicing through the morning mist. A flicker of warmth glimmered briefly as low voices gathered near a communal fire, where a few shared tired smiles and sips of mead. Those transient moments felt like defiant sparks in a cold, indifferent world, fleeting beacons before routine and hardship peeled back the fragile comfort. Then, almost imperceptibly, a shift, a glance exchanged between neighbors across the square, and the usual background noise dwindled into a tense hush. You caught the whisper of hurried footsteps, muffled but growing louder, a dread settling like an unwelcome fog. The game was about to change, and the quiet menace of a new threat began to squeeze the small sanctuary you'd carved out. Hey, before Morpheus takes you fully, check quickly if you're still subscribed. For some, the button disappeared, and I don't want you to miss the next bedtime stories. Enjoy leaving a like soft as a pillow. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it? Your interaction keeps this little corner of calm alive. Thanks for being part of it. The muffled clamor grew sharper now, rippling through the alley's damp embrace like a warning pulse. Your breath, visible in the chill air, came quick, shallow, an intruder to this fragile dawn. The murmurs morphed into sharp whispers, then into the scrape of hurried footsteps, uneven and desperate. Somewhere, beyond the fogged windows, the fragile peace had been shattered. Eyes flicking to the dark mouth of the alley, you caught the restless dance of shadows, figures emerging from the mist like phantoms, their faces blurred but tense, weighted with urgency. It wasn't the usual morning buzz of villagers trading rumors or the gruff bark of the town crier. No, this was different. The kind of silence that preceded trouble, or worse, something unspoken, but universally feared. Behind you, the cold stone bit harder through your threadbare cloak, as if reminding you that warmth was a fleeting luxury. You shifted, the scratch of worn leather gloves against rough fabric, prickling like old scars. Your hand instinctively tightened around the crooked dagger, its rusted curve reflecting what little faint light filtered through the mist. Tonight's dull chore had faded. Now, every moment demanded alertness. The game was no longer about simple survival, but about reading the subtle shifts in the town's uneasy breath. A sudden clatter near the fire pit startled the small cluster of villagers gathered there. Their faces, flickering in the trembling light, tightened with sudden alarm. You traced the source, a scattering of ash from a tossed ember, carried by a rogue gust of wind. Yet the effect was strangely symbolic. Ember and ash, life and ruin, straddling that thin line separating the ordinary from catastrophe. Moving forward cautiously, you stepped out from your hiding place. The air was colder here, each breath a white mist dissolving almost instantly. The village square yawned open, its cobblestones slick with frost like polished bones underfoot. The church bells, usually a lullaby for the waking world, tolled unevenly, a stuttering rhythm that spoke of distress rather than solace. Your gaze snagged on faces tightening in shadowy corners, their eyes darting like trapped animals, searching, fearing the unknown. A woman grasped her child, whispering hurried prayers under breath so low it might have been woven from the fog itself. The mead-smelling warmth of last night's fire had evaporated, replaced by a stark chill seeping into every crack and crevice. Despite the creeping dread, a faint thread of defiance lingered, a stubborn ember in the crowd's collective spine. Like those few candles flickering on windowsills, their soft glow cast against the overwhelming cold. It was hope's fragile silhouette refusing to be snuffed. Then, a sharp, almost indecipherable cry sliced through the quiet, a sound neither wholly human nor animal, but something stitched from panic and raw urgency. Heads snapped toward the sound source, the narrow path leading out of town, where shadow and mist tangled like a veil over unseen threats. The pack of villagers near the fire began to stir, hurried whispers growing louder, replaced by tense murmurs, punctuated by quick breaths and nervous glances. No one wanted to break the fragile spell of silence. Yet the invisible pressure tightened, nudging everyone toward preparation. You swallowed the sudden dryness in your throat. Hunger gnawed sharply in your belly. But sharper still was the surge of adrenaline, a cold fire igniting your limbs, even as your heart drummed a slow warning. The familiar grit of sawdust in your teeth earlier was no match for this moment's raw edge. A boy darted past, clutching a torn piece of cloth, breath ragged. His eyes met yours, a flicker of shared understanding in that brief, breathless instant. Words were unnecessary. The message was clear. Whatever shadow prowled just beyond the fog's grasp, it wouldn't wait. The villagers needed every hand, every blade. Even the unnoticed, the forgotten. You who had been hiding in the alley's silence were called upon. The church bell gave a final toll, long and sonorous, echoing off empty stone walls as if marking the end of innocence. Your gaze lifted skyward, tracing the first hopeless blush of dawn behind thick clouds. Pale and cold as ever, it promised no immediate relief, only the relentless march of time toward whatever awaited. Trailing your fingers over the familiar hilt of your dagger, you felt the rough grooves bite into your palm. It was both anchor and reminder, the everyday weight of a life balanced between quiet waiting and sudden struggle. The alley's dampness had seeped inside, but so had the resolve layered beneath the skin's fragile defenses. Near the edge of the square, a cluster of figures moved with purpose, their breath visible under threadbare cloaks, their faces set like stone. They gathered weapons, shared hurried words, hands brushing against the cold iron with practiced ease. A silent question hovered just beneath the frost-bitten air. Was there any hope left when the silent threat arrived unannounced? You stepped forward, with the jagged, uneven rhythm of the village fitting around your boots like a second heartbeat. The bitter bread from the night before still tasted like sawdust, but it felt insignificantly distant compared to the immediate pulse thudding in your veins. This was no longer just about enduring hunger or harsh winters. It was about survival in a shadow that felt as relentless as the cold. The fog thickened. The muffled footsteps drew closer. You could almost hear the quiet breath of the lurking menace, hidden yet palpable, wrapping the town in a tightening grip. Your skin prickled, and then, from the mist, a single figure emerged. Tall, cloaked, their face obscured, moving with an unnatural stillness that silenced even the restless wind. The alley's cold promise now had a face. You realized, as your dagger slipped quietly from your grasp to your palm, that the story was about to rewrite itself in blood and shadow. And you were no longer just a silent witness. The figure halted, just at the edge where the fog clung thickest, a shroud that seemed to bend and flow around them like liquid night. You could see nothing beneath the hood, but a faint outline traced their form, a presence too deliberate, too silent to be one of the waking villagers. This was something else, something carefully detached from the slow, rhythmic pulse of your town's uneasy awakening. Your fingers tightened on the hilt of the crooked dagger, the familiar rough grooves biting into your palm like a whispered promise of resistance. Behind you, the villagers clustered closer, breath shallow, eyes wide and searching. The cold seemed to contract around you all, every exhaled puff a fleeting ghost dissolving into the mist. Somewhere, a wooden shutter creaked, the sound startling for its fragility in the heavy air. The figure moved forward, gliding rather than walking, their steps erasing themselves as if swallowed by the cold earth. You caught the faintest scent, damp leather and something darker, like burnt sugar laced with bitter herbs. It was foreign and unsettling, a smell that set your nerves on edge deeper than the chill ever could. The first ray of dawn, a ghostly wash of pale blue-gray, filtered weakly through the fog, casting the alley into half-light. The town square stones gleamed like wet bones beneath your boots, slick with frost and cold sweat. Around you, villagers pressed closer, their whispered fears folding into one another, unwritten prayers as fragile as the first flicker of a candle flame. Your stomach grumbled, a harsh reminder from your hollow belly. The bitter bread from last night still lingered in your mouth, dry and gritty, like you'd been chewing on bark. Hunger was a familiar companion, but now it faded into the background of something far more urgent. A looming threat that felt like frostbite, creeping over skin and soul alike. The tall figure paused, turning their face slightly toward the cluster of watchers. A shard of moonlight caught the edge of something gleaming beneath the cloak, a blade, slender and cold. No clatter, no flash of steel, just the quiet promise of it, tucked near the hip like a secret waiting to unfold. A woman near the fire pit caught her breath and clutched a child tighter, murmuring a broken litany of words. The child's small face pressed into the folds of her cloak, eyes wide and unblinking in the growing chill. The ember glow was gone now, replaced by the hard gray light of reality, sinking in like icicles. The figure swept a long, slow gaze over the crowd, not with hostility, but with something colder yet inscrutable. It was the look of inevitability, the silent decree of a game whose rules only a few dared understand. No one moved to meet it, but none could look away. You stepped forward, the cold stone beneath your feet grounding you, even as your pulse hammered like a war drum. Your leather gloves creaked softly, worn reminders of countless days spent scraping by on fragile survival. The dagger gleamed faintly, a crooked smile in metal form, as if mocking the silence with its quiet threat. A surge of adrenaline flared sharp and wild through your veins, igniting every nerve. Your breath came faster, fog mingling with your ragged murmur. No words, just breaths and the raw, instinctive readiness to act. The villagers stirred restlessly, their faces masks painted with fear and defiance, caught between the desire to flee and the need to stand. From somewhere behind the thick curtain of fog came a whisper, barely audible, a name, a plea, or a warning you couldn't quite catch. The sound dissolved even as it reached your ears, swallowed whole by damp stone and morning mist. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, without warning, the figure lifted a hand. No gesture of peace, nor threat, just a slow, deliberate raise that sent a tremor through the gathered crowd. The subtle movement shattered the invisible thread holding back panic, as if the hourglass had run out of sand. A crack echoed suddenly, a thin, harsh snap, like a branch breaking under heavy boot. Eyes snapped toward the sound. A shadow moved hastily to the side, revealing a second figure, younger, more ragged, clutching a crude spear fashioned from a broken rake handle. The silent threat had backup. The chill deepened. The villagers' murmurs sharpened into hurried whispers. Fingers brushed against rough wood and cold iron. The warmth of defiant smiles faded like the last ember of the fire pit. You could almost taste the fear, a metallic, twitching thing curling in the throat. As the fog shifted once more, a small dog, once barking fiercely, fell silent, its hackles lowered. Even the animals knew better than to challenge the shadow now creeping over the town. You swallowed the lump forming in your throat. The hunger pressing at your ribs seemed distant, almost trivial now. The cloak around your shoulders pulled tight, soaked through with damp and resolve. The two figures at the edge of the square exchanged a brief glance. Something unspoken passed between them, a signal, an order that struck the air like cold iron. With a voice neither loud nor soft, but full of quiet authority, the tall figure spoke a single word. It cut through the fog like a blade sliding through leather. Ready. The word rippled through the crowd, carrying a weight far heavier than its sound. It was no longer just a morning wrapped in mist. It was the beginning of a reckoning. Your pulse surged in a frenzy, threads of adrenaline weaving purpose through every fiber of your being. The dagger in your hand felt alive, humming with cold potential. And just as you braced for what would come next, a distant shout shattered the fragile stillness. A voice torn between fear and command, echoing over the rooftops. Somewhere, the first crack of chaos was born. The morning fog swirled fiercely, hiding everything now, except the certainty that whatever darkness had descended upon your town was no longer a shadow lurking in silence. It was alive, it was moving, and its eyes were fixed on you. The cold air wrapped tighter around you as the shadow at the edge of the square shifted. An echo of movement swallowed by the thick fog, yet impossibly deliberate. You could feel the uneasy weight of every breath held nearby. The flickering faces of villagers caught between terror and defiance. The heavy silence seemed to harden the very stones beneath your boots, turning the street into a stage set for an unfolding drama you never wished to attend, but here you stood nevertheless. The tall figure's cloak whispered against frost-coated cobblestones, its slow glide more a ghost's glide than any human step. You noticed how the damp fog clung heavier around this presence, as if it drew the chill into itself, swallowing light and hope alike. Your fingers curled tighter around the crooked dagger's worn hilt, the familiar grooves like an anchor amidst the swirling dread. Behind the figure, the younger one tucked the crude spear closer to their chest, eyes darting with a frantic energy that barely masked a deeper fear. The pair, Shadow and Ragged Echo, held a strange, tensioned partnership, silent yet spoken in every tight breath and measured step. You swallowed hard, the dryness of your throat matching the bitter tang lingering on your tongue. Like last night's sawdust-stuffed bread. Hunger had become background noise next to what was pressing now, a sharp urgency settling deeper than cold. The murmurs around you stretched, fraying into uneasy silence again, broken only by the soft murmur of prayers, whispered half to steady frightened children, half to stall the darkness gathering like a storm. Near the fire pit, the faint glow of dying embers clung stubbornly to existence, casting a weak circle of warmth in a kingdom governed by cold. Suddenly, a distant cracking sound ripped through the silence, a twig snapping underfoot, sharp and final. Every head snapped toward the source, breath hitching in collective shock. The ragged figure twitched, spear raised defensively, as if anticipating an unseen enemy. You couldn't tell if the crack was a prelude or a warning, but instinct screamed that waiting was over. The moment stretched, taut as a drawn bowstring ready to snap. A few villagers shifted uneasily, bodies flickering between fight and flight, shadows dancing with whispered fears. Then the tall figure finally spoke again, voice low, steady but chilling in its calm authority. Prepare. No elaboration, no explanation, just a cold command that struck the crowd like a sudden breeze through a shuttered window. The hive of murmur collapsed into sharp readiness. Blades were drawn, boots scraped against stone, and hands clasped trembling weapons with resolve sharpened by desperation. You felt your own pulse quicken, the dagger suddenly a heavier weight, full of promises and threats. The stone beneath your feet no longer felt like mere ground. It was lineage, survival, and raw pulse of a battle of the corner of your eye. A few neighbors exchanged glances, faces pale but determined, silent oaths passing between them, visible only in the way their hands tightened on handles and shoulders squared against invisible winds. This was no longer a vague menace. It was an encroaching storm you had to meet, whether you liked it or not. A soft wind curled through the alleys, carrying scents that twisted your stomach, damp earth, bitter herbs mingling with the faint, acrid sharpness of smoke, like some distant fire still glowing in dark woods. You wondered, briefly, how long it had been since the last time anything burned freely here without casting shadows of ruin, and just as quickly you pushed the thought away. There was no room for nostalgia, only now. An anxious dog whimpered somewhere close, its low sound swallowed by the thickening fog. Even the animals seemed to know the gravity of the moment, their instincts sharper than yours, perhaps. The figure's cloak swirled silently, the tall one stepping forward just enough to pin the assembled crowd with their gaze. A glance stripped of mercy, heavy with all the unsaid consequences waiting in the wings. The cold itself seemed to press closer, compressing the space between hearts beating wild with dread. Your breath forced out in a ragged exhale, moisture freezing as it left your lips. The knife in your hand gleamed faintly, absurdly serene, like a crooked smile that dared the darkness to come near. The village's breath pooled around you, a collective intake before the plunge, fragile as the dying light struggling through thick clouds above. The first real dawn had started, pale and unforgiving, but inside you, the darkness was already alive, waiting to be met. Then, a sudden cry tore through the haze, a sound raw and sharp, as if fear itself had found voice. Heads snapped toward the narrow road leading out, where shadows twisted unnaturally, threatening to spill across the waking world. You stepped forward, heart pounding a warrior's rhythm, the chill no longer an enemy, but a companion, pushing you to stand taller, your eyes locked with the figure's hidden face, a silent message passing between you. The veil of quiet was lifted, the game had changed, and escape was no longer an option. The fog thickened once more, swallowing everything beyond the square in a cold, hungry silence. And then you saw it, gleaming faintly beneath the clouds, like a star fallen into mortal hands, a blade raised. It was not just a shadow anymore. It was the beginning. The blade hung suspended beneath the fading cloak, a promise shadowed in steel. The tall figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, the fog curling and parting like a curtain at the movement. Each breath you drew tasted colder now, as if the very air conspired to strip away warmth before the clash could begin. Around you, the villagers pressed tighter, silent witnesses caught between paralysis and readiness. Their faces were pale sketches, etched with fear sharpened by the unrelenting frost. They clutched meager weapons, the wood and iron trembling with uncertain hopes. The faint glow of dying embers near the fire pit was all that resisted the encroaching gloom, casting long, flickering shadows that danced like ghosts, desperate to hold on to light. Your gaze locked once more on the hooded figure, whose presence swallowed sound and hope alike. The hesitation you might have felt dissolved. This was no longer a silhouette of threat. It was the harbinger of inevitable reckoning. A sudden crack shattered the brittle quiet, barely louder than a twig snapping underfoot, but enough to send a jolt through the assembled crowd. The younger figure, clutching the crude spear, stiffened, their eyes darting wildly like a cornered animal. You felt the air thicken, tension tightening like a drawn bowstring, threatening to snap apart. The tall figure's voice broke through the morning cold with measured calm. Advance. It was an order and a warning. Folded move, almost gliding rather than stepping. Each advance seemed to erode the boundary between night and day, peace and chaos. The mist thickened, swallowing the figure's form bit by bit, but the sharp glint of steel lingered like a sliver of finality. You shifted your weight on the frost-laced cobblestones, your leather gloves creaking softly as your fingers tightened around your crooked dagger's familiar hilt. The cold bit into your skin through countless tiny holes in your defenses, but your grip never faltered. Behind you, whispers grew restless, voices twisting themselves into hurried prayers, desperate and reverent. Children pressed closer to their parents, eyes wide and shimmering like fragile lanterns in the gray. The scent of damp earth tangled with the bitter smoke of a distant fire, an acrid reminder that warmth was already fracturing beneath the weight of the gathering storm. Your stomach knotted painfully, hunger gnawing at your resolve. But it was a distant ache compared to the sharp pulse beating through your veins. Survival was no longer about stale bread and bitter mead. It was about meeting the dawn with cold steel and steady breath. Another snap echoed, this time closer, sharper. The villagers stiffened, hands shifting their grips, feet sliding uncertainly on slick stone. The younger figure stepped forward, spear raised in trembling defiance. Their gaze met yours fleetingly, a spark of raw, silent plea passing between you. The unspoken weight of every stolen moment hidden in shadow settled heavier now. The tall figure halted again, turning slow and deliberate, casting their eyes over the crowd as if reading secrets no one dared voice aloud. The shape was precise and unnaturally still, a frozen wraith commanding the ephemeral stage. No mercy gleamed in that gaze, only stark certainty. That certainty rippled outward, setting off a wave of resolve among the villagers. Eyes hardened, breath steadied. The fragile embers of defiance flared stubbornly, like stars clinging to a winter sky, relentless in its darkness. You stepped forward, boots scraping softly against frozen stone, the sound muted, but ringing in your ears. The dagger felt heavier now, alive with cold intent, a crooked smile daring the shadow to strike. A shiver ran down your spine, not from cold, but from the sudden awakening of your senses. The faintest movement caught your eye, a flicker of ragged cloth barely visible beyond the mist's grasp. Somewhere, the last barking dog shifted, its growl silenced abruptly, an instinctive surrender to the weight of what was coming. The longer you stared into the obscurity, the more the town felt swallowed whole by it. The boundaries of day and night blurred, as if time itself hesitated, reluctant to watch what would unfold. Voices cracked, a strange shout breaking free from the tight cluster of villagers. It carried a blend of command and raw fear, echoing like a brittle wing flapping desperately against the encroaching quiet. The call rose and fell, swallowed quickly, but it sent a ripple through the crowd, sharpening senses, igniting a simmering fight beneath wary exteriors. Then, a sudden rush of movement shattered what's left of stillness. The younger figure lunged first, thrusting forward with the crude spear, a desperate arc cutting through the fog. The tall figure shifted effortlessly, a shadow slipping past the strike as if answering an ancient rhythm no one else heard. The blade gleamed once, too fast, too cold to follow, and then silence again, thick and suffocating. Your heart thundered in response, bursting through ribcage and silence alike. You tightened your grasp on the dagger, stepping from the crowd, the world narrowing to the hiss of your breath and the dull scrape of steel carving fate. The fog swirled violently, masking shapes and threats, blending ally and enemy alike into a single tide of shadows. The village square, a stage of stone and frost, was now a crucible where innocence melted into necessity. You felt it settling over your skin, a greasy cold that clung like a second blood. A slanted beam of pale dawn broke suddenly through the mist, spotlighting a figure frozen, in motion, hood thrown back, face still hidden, but the blade raised gleamed viciously in the hungry light. The final breath of peace shattered with a whisper, then a scream that echoed from near and far, lifeblood spilling unseen into the chill air. And as your dagger rose, trembling but resolute, the world tilted, waiting for the first strike that would rewrite everything. The shadow was no longer just a shape on the edge of the square. It had come alive, demanding to be met. And you understood then, with the iron clarity of cold against skin. There was no turning back. The tall figure's movement sliced through the creeping mist with a ghostly ease, each step methodical, as if the very fog parted out of respect or fear. Your breath caught, hanging brittle in the cold air, mingling with the faint smoke of distant chimneys and the damp, earthy scent pressing against your senses. Around you, the villagers tightened their circle, shadows trembling as if aware their fragile sanctuary was about to crumble. Your gloved hand tightened on the crooked dagger, the worn leather biting into your palm like an old, familiar pain. The blade, dull and rust-streaked, felt sharper now, alive with the raw pulse of readiness. That uneasy calm before the storm had settled deep in your bones, steeling you against whatever was to come. A woman beside you clasped the arm of her trembling child, her whispered prayers a fragile veil against the encroaching dread. Behind them, the fire pit's last embers flicker weakly, casting tenuous light that seemed swallowed by the night, creeping closer with every breath. You could almost taste the cold, sharp and unforgiving, as though winter itself sneaked through the gaps in the stone walls, wrapping the town in a steely grip. The tall figure halted, turning with slow deliberation. The hood slipped back, just enough to reveal a pale, unreadable face, eyes glinting with the hard light of inevitability. Without speaking, the figure extended a gloved hand and pointed toward the narrow path beyond the square. A silent summons, carved from shadow. The younger companion, spear held tightly, shivered but stepped forward without hesitation. The air shifted again, charged with the unspoken promise of violence and the weight of survival pressing down like the frost beneath your boots. You swallowed the sharp dryness stuck in your throat, hunger, the constant pang gnawing at your insides like a ghost from last night's sawdust-stretched bread faded into a distant murmur beneath the pounding rhythm of resolve. This was no time for weakness. A clamorous shout rang out, cracking through the frozen silence. It wasn't loud, but it carried. A fragmented plea laced with fear and resolve, from somewhere beyond the veil of fog. Heads snapped toward the source, eyes wide and searching. The villagers, no longer content to just watch and wait, edged forward, clutching whatever weapons they could muster. Rusted blades, sharpened sticks, chipped stones. Fingers curled tight around chilled wood and cold iron. The tension in their shoulders spoke of the harsh truth. This dawn would be remembered, not for its pale beauty, but for the reckoning it bore. You stepped out from the shadows, boots scraping softly against the frozen cobbles. The air was sharp against your lungs, each breath a cloud dissolving into the morning mist. For a moment, the cold pressed in on all sides, wrapping your ragged cloak and biting at your skin. But beneath it, a fire flickered, a stubborn ember buried beneath years of hardship and waiting. The tall figure observed with unreadable eyes, their cold gaze scanning the nervous crowd before settling on you. A flicker passed between you, a faint, silent acknowledgement that the game was changing, that your silence was over. There would be no more hiding. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught the corner of your eye. From behind a pile of rotting crates, a shadow shifted, almost imperceptible. The younger figure's grip on the spear tightened. The fog swirled, thick and suffocating, swallowing shapes whole, blurring the boundary between friend and foe. A harsh, sharp cry split the air, half human, half animal. Every head snapped to the source. Somewhere close, a dog whimpered, retreating into the deeper gloom with lowered hackles. The threat was no longer distant. You felt your pulse pound, each beat a hammering drum of adrenaline. Your fingers bled faintly against the dagger's worn hilt, pain grounding you in the present. The long shadows stretched and twisted across the square. turning familiar faces ghostly and strange. Every sound was magnified, the distant caw of a crow, the rustle of threadbare cloaks, the click of stone against stone. The tall figure lifted a hand slowly, deliberately, palm down, a gesture that carried no promise of peace. It felt like the lowering of a curtain. "Stand," the voice came, soft yet razor-sharp, carving silence into the gathering crowd. No one moved to flee, nor to attack. All held their breath, caught in the space between fear and defiance. A slow, cruel smile tugged at the corner of your mouth, half shock, half grim amusement. The game was no longer invisible. It was here, and you were part of it. Then out of the swirling mist came a sudden rush, too fast to track, too deadly to ignore. The younger figure, the sound filling the cavernous space between moments. The villagers held their ground, faces pale but burning with the faintest glow of resilience. You took a step forward, dagger poised, body ready as the chill seeped deeper. The frost beneath your boots felt less like an enemy now, and more like a stage set for what was to come. From somewhere behind the shifting fog, a low scream, a sound torn from the depths of panic and courage, broke free, echoing off stone and sky. The crackling tension snapped tight just before everything plunged. The tall figure, hood fallen back entirely now, stepped fully into the sparse light. The face was gaunt, marked with shadows deeper than the mist around you. Eyes piercing, unyielding, like the winter itself had taken form and come seeking. Your breath caught as the figure's blade rose again, catching that pale dawn's meager glow, a silent herald of the violent dawn breaking over your world. Time seemed to still, the fog holding its breath, and then the first clash of steel rang out, sharp, resonant, unavoidable. The battle had begun. The clash of steel echoed sharp and unforgiving across the frost-coated square, slicing the silence like a shard of ice. Your dagger was suddenly heavier in your hand, alive with a biting promise as the first move shattered the fragile truce that had held the morning in suspended tremor. The tall figure's cloak whipped aside with a whisper, revealing a swift, precise strike that met desperation with cold skill. The younger attacker stumbled back, breath ragged, spear trembling like a broken branch over frozen ground. The fog swirled, thick around the two of them, blurring edges, swallowing noise, until the fight felt like a shadow play, with only the glint of steel and the weight of breath marking its rhythm. Your gaze flicked to the villagers, pressed in the square's margins, pale faces etched with fear and flickering defiance, eyes wide as lanterns in a dark room. A woman clutched her child tighter, whispering prayers so low they might have been spells cast against the chill. The fire pit's last embers fought the encroaching cold, their orange hunger barely aglow against the gray dawn. Your own breath sounded loud in the silence, a ragged drumbeat in the pit of thunderous uncertainty. You took a cautious step forward, the frost slipping underfoot, each footfall a careful negotiation with the shuddering ground beneath. The dust of sawdust-laced bread from last night's meager meal still lingered bitter on your tongue, distanced now by the pulse of adrenaline burning through your veins. The tall figure moved with an unnerving grace, shadow and steel melding into one. Their blade flashed again, a cruel smile carved in cold metal, parrying, striking, always just beyond reach. The younger combatant's eyes flickered with raw panic and stubborn will, desperation, knitting muscle and bone into a fragile barrier against the inevitable. Time warped, seconds stretching thin as the struggle carried on, the fog swallowing noise and light alike. The villagers' murmurs frayed into silence, breath held tight beneath the weight of watching eyes. Somewhere a dog whimpered, withdrawing into shadow, as if knowing this was no place for innocence. Your hands shook, leather gloves creaking softly as you gripped your dagger tighter. The cold bit through every frayed seam of your cloak, a sharp contrast to the fire now kindling deep inside your chest, a white-hot ember forged by fear and resolve alike. The alley's damp chill was forgotten in the sudden surge of living, raw urgency. Suddenly, the tall figure stepped back, blade lowered, but eyes locked on the crowd. The pale dawn light caught their face, gaunt and lined, the skin almost translucent in its stillness. Their voice, when it came, was quiet yet slicing through the frozen morning like a scythe. Enough. The word hung heavy. A command and a reckoning rolled into one. The younger attackers sank to their knees, clutching the spear with shaking hands, eyes wild and unseeing. The crowd exhaled as one, the tension unraveling, briefly, but leaving behind a sharper edge, the uneasy quiet before something darker. You took a breath, the cold air a razor at your lungs, and stepped fully into view, the uneven cobblestones biting into your boots. The villagers parted just enough for you to step forward, the dagger in your fist feeling like the final thread connecting you to all that fragile defiance. From behind the veil of fog, a crackling sound rippled close, dry twigs breaking under heavy boots, the subtle herald of more shadows moving. Every head snapped in that direction, the collective heart skipping a beat. The tall figure's gaze flicked sharply, muscles tensing beneath the cloak. Their hand moved from the blade, fingers curling into a fist, knuckles white beneath the worn leather. The sharp light of dawn was fading behind. Dense clouds, the sky a muted gray canvas, ready to swallow everything whole. Without warning, a figure burst from the mist, cloaked, furious, and moving with the wild desperation of someone who had run too far, too fast. The newcomer's voice tore through the stillness, rough and urgent. They're coming, from the forest, not alone. Shock rippled through the villagers like a cold current. Whispers turned to gasps. The woman by the fire pit stumbled, clutching her child. Closer still, the tall figure met the newcomer's eyes, the slow nod passing between them. A silent exchange, heavy with weight and consequence. The tension in the air was suddenly electric, an unseen thread tightening across the crowd. Your heart hammered in response, each beat a deafening drum in the stillness. The cold now felt like a distant echo, swallowed by the storm growing in your chest. Around you, the village seemed to lean forward, breath sharp and ready, caught between the receding dawn and the gathering darkness. And then, as if the very earth responded to the rising threat, the fog shifted, parting with a slow, deliberate grace to reveal a pair of glowing eyes, faint but certain, watching from just beyond the trees. The quiet before the storm was over. You raised your dagger again, the crooked blade gleaming faintly with the promise of fight and survival. The first true shadow stepped into the light, and the reckoning was about to begin. The clash of steel had barely settled into the cold morning when the distant sound of hurried footsteps tore through the fog like a breath held too long. Finally, released, your heart surged anew, each beat pounding against your ribs as if trying to break free of its cage. The square, still slick and shining like the bones of some ancient beast, seemed to grow smaller with every second, the fog pressing in tighter, an unseen weight threatening to suffocate what little hope lingered. You squinted toward the narrowing path, where shadows tangled with mist, struggling to make out the form breaking through. It was a figure, but no longer cloaked with hesitation. This one moved with a desperate grace, born from raw fear and urgent purpose. Clothes torn and mud-caked, the silhouette raced onward, breaths sharp puffs of white in the chill air. Behind them, a ragged cry pealed out, a fractured howl, neither wholly human nor beast, before it was swallowed by the oppressive. Silence that followed like a shroud. The villagers stiffened, shadows rippling as one collective shudder ran through the crowd. They tightened ranks instinctively, weapons rising in trembling hands. The woman who held her child clung tighter, face pale but set, her whispered prayers lost in the cold dawn. Your cracked gloves gripped your crooked dagger as if it were the only lifeline in a sea of frost. The leather whispered and creaked against your skin. A dull but grounding reminder of every narrow escape and every lonely, bitter night. Hunger clawed quietly beneath it all, but now it was swallowed by the urgent roar of survival. Sharp, raw, primal. The newcomer burst into the square, chest heaving, as they scanned the crowd with wild eyes. "They're here!" The voice broke free suddenly, rough, cracked like splintered wood, and echoed off empty walls. From the forest, not one, many. The words sparked a ripple across the assembly, like a flicker of fire reaching dry tinder. Faces shifted, breath caught, fists clenched, eyes locked on the distant tree line, where the fog twisted and churned like an angry sea. Shadows shifted, too many, too restless. The sharp tang of smoke and damp earth filled your nose, mingling with the metallic tinge of fear that coated the air. A low growl rolled through the street. A dog, once fierce, now retreating into deeper shade with hackles lowered. Even beasts sensed the storm brewing. The tall figure at the edge of the square stepped forward again, blade gleaming faintly in the feeble dawn, eyes like frozen lakes reflecting cold certainty. Their face was stark now, unhidden beneath the hood, marked by hard lines carved deeper than the bitter cold. They met your gaze with an unreadable intensity you couldn't look away from. Without a word, a command hung in that frozen moment. Prepare. The villagers around you tensed, the fabric of fragile courage knitting tighter. Weapons were raised, not with confidence, but resolve sharpened by dread. Every face told the same story. The time for hiding was over. You stepped up beside the tall figure, the worn stones beneath your boots, an unyielding stage for the reckoning. Each breath you exhaled plumed in front of you, a ghost fading into the mist. Your rough fingers tightened on the dagger's hilt. It felt alive, humming with possibility, the promise of defiance in cold steel. A chorus of whispers rippled through the crowd, fragments of prayers, half-told stories, faltering hopes. Somewhere, a child whimpered softly, pressed close against trembling parents. The fire pit, a dying heart of embers, pulsed weakly with a last stubborn flicker, a beacon for lost warmth. The fog broke suddenly, rushed back by a myriad of movements. Figures emerged, pale and ragged, eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Their forms blurred in the thick air like specters made real, relentless as winter's bite. The sharp crack of breaking twigs sounded again, louder, closer now. The crowd froze, muscles coiled tight as steel springs. The tall figure raised the blade, its edge catching the pale dawn in a gleam that was both invitation and warning. Your breath hitched. From the fog, a figure burst out, a silhouette moving with violent grace, reaching for the throat of the coming march. A scream tore free from the newcomers, raw and shattered, answered immediately by a chorus of dark replies from the advancing shapes. The village square no longer held the fragile calm of morning. It had become a crucible where light and shadow melted into one cold truth. The fight had begun. You moved forward, each step deliberate, the sound of your boots swallowed by the symphony of anticipation. The world tilted, every sense straining to catch the impossible details hidden between inhalations and the swirling breath of the fog. Then, as your dagger rose, gleaming crooked and worn like a crooked smile. A chilling realization settled over you. The dawn was no longer the promise of renewal. It was the stage for a reckoning written in frost and blood. And from the shrouded timberline, a dozen eyes blinked. Cold fire, focused, unyielding, locking onto the square and onto you. The morning froze into a heartbeat. And then, silence before the storm. The clash had passed, but the echo of steel lingered like a distant drumbeat fading into stillness. The fog, once thick and suffocating, now thinned slowly as the tentative morning light stretched its pale fingers over the frost-bitten stones. You stood, breath heavy but steady, the crooked dagger still warm in your hand, not from fire, but from the blood and the tension that had surged through every moment since dawn. Around you, the villagers stirred, their faces marked by exhaustion, fear, and a fragile relief that seemed almost impossible to grasp. The tall figure who had commanded the reckoning stepped back, hood fallen, and revealed a face worn yet resolute. Their eyes, sharp and clear, met yours briefly, a silent passing of trust and understanding. No words were spoken, none were needed. The forest's edge lay quiet now, the shadowed threat retreating like a tide pulled away by the dawn's fragile promise. The ragged shapes that had emerged so relentlessly were gone, dispersed by the fierce resistance and the unexpected unity of those who had once cowered in silence. You lowered your blade, the weight slowly easing from your grip, replaced by a steady ache threading through your limbs. Hunger gnawed at your belly, but it no longer felt like a condemnation, rather a quiet reminder that life would resume in its raw, imperfect way. The bitter breath of night, the chill seeping through tattered cloaks, the musty alley where this story had begun. All these small fragments gathered now into a greater picture of survival and defiance. Nearby, the glow from the fire pit flickered back to life. Embers coaxed gently by careful hands. A woman offered a weary smile as her child pressed close. The warmth they shared, a silent victory over the cold that had so recently threatened to swallow them whole. Your presence, once unnoticed, was now felt, an emblem of the quiet courage stitched into the fabric of the village. The distant church bells tolled once more, their uneven rhythm now tempered with a sense of resilience. The day was unfolding anew, a world freshly scrubbed by frost and shadow, holding its breath between the past scars and whatever uncertain peace the future might bring. You stepped into the square, the rough stones grounding you, as the first true light softened the edges of fear and dread. The cold was still there, but it no longer bit with malice. Instead, it caressed, like a reminder that life, with all its cruelty and beauty, would endure, slow and steady, like the sunrise itself. Your gloves bore the wear of 1,000 struggles, yet your hands moved with a calm purpose, gathering what fragments of hope remained in this fragile dawn. The crooked dagger, now dull and scarred, was a token of everything you had weathered: the silent vigils, the sudden storms, and the quiet resistance that refused to be extinguished. Voices began to rise, low and cautious at first, then with growing confidence. Neighbors spoke in whispers, turned to words, sharing the unseen burden lifted just slightly. Eyes met, and in those gazes there was a shared reckoning. Unspoken promise that this moment would linger in memory, not merely as a day of fear, but as a testament to resilience. You let yourself breathe, slow and deep, the cold air filling your lungs as if absorbing the weight of what had passed. The damp stone walls of the alley no longer pressed in on you with menace, but held the quiet stories of survival carved into their every crack. A gentle breeze stirred the mist that still clung faintly to the edges of the town, scattering pale threads of fog like whispered farewells. The trees beyond held their secrets close, but you knew the threat, whatever it was, had broken against a wall stronger than shadow, the will to stand together. As you turned from the square, the frost sparkled faintly beneath your boots, light catching on ice like distant stars scattered at your feet. The village would wake slowly from this night of unrest, and you could almost hear the rhythm of life rethreading itself. Soft footsteps, whispered laughter, the subtle murmur of hope growing in the spaces left empty by fear. Your shoulders eased, the threadbare cloak pulled tighter, not against the cold, but as a shroud of quiet accomplishment. The journey that had carried you through long hours of waiting, dread, and sudden violence now reached its gentle close. And as you moved back toward the alleys that had sheltered you, the narrow streets bathed in the soft glow of a tentative sun, a peace settled like a balm, faint, yes, but real. It was enough to quiet the hunger, enough to still the racing heart, enough to hold the silence with a new kind of weight, one not of fear, but of finality, a promise that no matter how dark the night, the dawn would always come. And so you let yourself lean into the slow, steady pulse of the waking town, a pulse that mirrored your own. The cold still lingered, but within it, the echo of a crooked smile, a hardened blade, and a story finally told. Tomorrow, the streets would call again, the hardships would return, with familiar faces and old echoes. But tonight, just for this moment, the world was quiet, and you rested. The cloak of dawn wrapped around you like a whispered lullaby, soft and sure. The shadows had passed, the story had ended, and now the night's breath folded you gently into sleep.